Hi, welcome everybody. I hope there's a few of you that have already joined, and yeah, thank you very much for joining us. We've got two of our three panelists so far. Paul Kelly is just on the phone paying off his car insurance or failed MOT, whichever one you wish to believe. So he'll be back live with us very shortly. So apologies about that. But yeah, thanks again for joining us. Looking at the list of names who have signed up, there's a lot of very familiar names, but also quite a few new names. So I'll just give you a brief introduction before we crack on and introduce you to the panelists. So for those of you who don't know, 3Search is a sort of digitally marketing focused recruitment agency. And I was brought into the company in May of 2018 to head up and build out our data analytics and insights recruitment function. So that's been my focus for the last 2.5 years or so. And historically at 3Search, we've run a lot of in-person events with a wide range of topics for our candidates and clients, but yeah, clearly 2020 had other ideas on allowing us to do that. So we're using it as a chance to host more webinars, and this is just one in a series of webinars that will be running over the next 6 to 9 months or so before hopefully we can go back to live events. So if you want to hear about any more, just give 3Search a follow on LinkedIn. But yeah, awesome panel today. We've got Paul Kelly, the head of commercial technology at Intuit. We've got Ivan Taliadoros, who's the senior manager of commercial analytics at Just Eat. And we've got Christine, who is the director of data analytics at Warner Music Group. So hopefully some fantastic insights for you to take away. The rough idea is that we'll cover a variety of topics for 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be a 10-minute Q&A at the end. You should all be able to type questions should you wish to. There should be a chat at the bottom, so feel free to type away throughout the webinar, and we will try and cover off as many of the questions you have at the end. But yeah, I'll introduce you to the panel, or let the panel introduce themselves. Paul, do you want to kick off and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Paul Kelly. I'm the head of, I've just had it changed actually, it's now go-to-market technology. So very much running the technology for everything that goes to market, but not the product itself. So really excited to get some of your questions. Really excited to talk about the conversation around data and data analytics and how we can get our message to business people.
Thank you. And Ivan, it'd be great to introduce yourself.
So hello everyone. My name is Evangelos, and I lead the commercial analytics team in Just Eat, focusing on the UK market. And have been in a number of analytical roles in different companies, including British Airways, Sky, and as of the last 2 years in Just Eat. So looking forward to taking the questions and also discussing with the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you. And last but by no means least, Christine.
Hey everybody, I am Christina Sazwa. I am the Director of Data and Insights for the Global Marketing Team at Warner Music Group. It's one of the 3 major labels, and I run our data strategy in order to decide our global priorities. I have a background in music and entertainment. And Rupert, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk with everybody.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, big thank you to all 3 of you for spending your valuable time and coming on to do this. So yeah, without sort of further ado, I guess we'll crack on with some of the topics that I hope some of you are keen to hear about. So certainly as a recruiter in this space, one of the biggest challenges that I hear is that analytics teams can sometimes struggle to gain the trust and respect of the senior leadership team. So I was keen to explore this and understand how, as a sort of data and analytics leader, you go about trying to sort of gain the trust and respect of the relevant stakeholders that you need to have an influence on the business. Yeah, if Christine, you want to kick us off, because I know in the sort of a creative industry, this can be particularly, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, of course. Like you mentioned, I work in a creative industry. So because of that, the expectation for people to be data literate and very tech savvy is not always there. I think the biggest area that you have to focus on is being really attentive to your audience. Know what your audience expectation is, know what their level of understanding of data is, and that helps you kind of tailor what your messaging is going to be. One example is I sent a report out to a label president a few days back, and it had not a single number on it. It had some mood boards, for example. It had some color coding and things like that that kind of showed different trends, show different projections without having to bombard them with numbers, because I know that person was not going to go into the numbers. They just wanted to understand, hey, what happened? Show me the overarching concepts, basically. So if you know how to tailor your messaging and tailor your delivery to different audiences, it will definitely help you make that impact at the C level, because they know what to expect, and you've kind of prepped them for that, and they're in that right headspace to take in all that information.
Fantastic. And how many sort of different stakeholders do you have to manage, and how many different teams are you sort of trying to do this with?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned before, I work on a global marketing team, and global is actually just that. I correspond with 45 different labels and territories, probably on almost a weekly basis, basically across the whole world. And so lots of different stakeholders, just from a culture, language, time zone standpoint. But in addition to that, I'm also working really closely with our analysts across the company as a whole, their bosses, who are often not very technical. And then I'm corresponding with the C-suite and the SVP level as well on a regular basis. So from very technical people that I might have a conversation with our data engineering team. So that'll be a very technical conversation where I'm like, hey, we need to use this API and put this in the S3 bucket. My boss does not know what that means. And then, or I go from the other side of things where I'm talking to like someone at SVP or a CEO level, where it's more of like, hey, this is what happened last week. This is why it happened. This is what we're going to do about it. And much more concrete, like actionable items, basically.
Nice. And throughout your time there, have you seen a shift in the trust that you've managed to gain as a result of some of the findings that you provided to the group?
Yeah, your capital, like your currency in an industry like this, is the capital that you develop and the trust you develop with people, by providing them the information they need in a timely manner, and providing them the correct information is really important. So one thing that I'm teaching, like my direct report as well, is about making sure you build a reputation. So you're building relationships. So building relationships with all different levels means that you have a lot of, like, basically you need a lot of people in your corner. Not everyone is as data driven as you might be. So you need a lot of like data advocates that you keep around you, so that they can also vouch for you, vouch for the data, vouch for why it's important. So I have people from kind of every spectrum of the company and every level and all over the world that can attest to the work I've done, but also can attest to the power of data, so that when I need someone to back me up on something, I've already had those conversations, built that relationship where I'm like, hey, we talked about this before. Can you explain this to your boss? Because they might know. I don't know everyone's learning style. I don't know everyone's familiarity with data. But if I have a relationship with someone on a different team, I can say, hey, would you be able to explain this to your boss in a different way that they might understand, for example? And that really helps to build that relationship. And I think that's also been helpful to like build that trust across the company as a whole.
Perfect, thank you. And Paul, I know you're relatively new to the business. You've been where you are less than a year, so it's not so long since you went through that interview process yourself. And obviously, COVID has thrown in probably different challenges to yourself, trying to sort of build some of those relationships on the likes of Zoom and such. It'd be really interesting to hear how you've gone about it and how it's worked for you over the last 12 months or so.
Sure, I think, and just going back in previous jobs as well, where I think when you start out, trust is that people really want to trust you, but they don't trust you, and you've got to be really, considered by what you take forward and what you don't. There's normally either tons of stuff or nothing. They're the two sort of places have taken over. There's no data, or there's tons of data and you don't know what to do with it all, and you don't know how to assimilate it and drive meaningful insights out of it. And so you've got to be really, really precise with what it is. What are you going to champion, and is it going to get you results? And you need something. You need to champion something. You need to pull the data together to champion something that is going to make a meaningful difference, and it's going to do so quickly. So I think my biggest learning was making sure that when we had done a piece of work, that piece of work really did have a powerful impact at the C-suite level. It really was clear. It drove change. It created a business outcome, not necessarily a fantastic piece of analytics or a brilliant hypothesis, but it had a business outcome, and it drove change, and it moved the needle and made them change direction. Maybe it was a small change, and that builds trust. When that small change works, you get a medium-sized change, and then you get a large change, and over time you do shift the needle a lot. I think we're slightly different to Christine. Working at FMS company, it is all about the numbers, and all of the staff are literate with the numbers, and they want to crawl all over you about the numbers, and they want to, and that is pretty much in any job. For me, the technology numbers and the sort of marketing analytics, but we have another analytics team as well, which does a lot of the business analytics, and they get really interrogated on the numbers. So having real confidence in going with a really clear, precise narrative that is going to make a small change at first that you can then build upon and your reputation grows is probably my biggest piece of advice.
That's really useful. Thank you very much, Paul. And finally, even I know that you've been fortunate enough to work in two sort of very data-driven companies in Sky and currently Just Eat, but I still imagine there's certain stakeholder challenges that you've faced within those. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on how you go about dealing with those challenges.
Yeah, it's to a large extent, a very customized approach, and typically there are some ways that work better in different levels. So, for example, very senior stakeholders, and what I found that is working well in terms of building that trust to a large extent, especially as someone that you are probably new to a company, is actually, but also at a later stage as well. It's a lot to do around listening and understanding really where they're coming from, and also trying to see things that they don't necessarily want to see, but things are actually that will actually help them. They're sort of the things I tend to call the things that they need, but they don't know that they actually need them. So listening often helps in order of building that trust, and sort of then if you listen, you then customize and be very specific to the communications with that when you actually have those discussions with them. And by having very customized and very targeted communications, it helps to build that trust. And the other thing, obviously, is that at different levels you have different type of stakeholders, and when you have a lot of stakeholders that are not necessarily very data driven, very sort of analytical, then it becomes again to understanding what's the best approach in order to communicate to them, again listening and understanding where they're coming from, how they view the world, and what is the way things that they're actually used to. Like, for example, from a marketing team, they might want a much more creative, colorful type of presentation with the fewest numbers as possible, and that by sort of understanding where they're coming from, by listening how they are tackling and how they're viewing problems, then that helps you in order to then customize what you deliver to them.
Perfect, thank you. I think that leads us quite nicely on to my next question, which is around presenting back to some non-technical stakeholders, and how what sort of tools your teams are using and what tactics your teams are using to present those findings back to non-technical audiences would be great to hear about. So even as you were talking about it, I don't know if you would like to just sort of talk about some of the technologies you use and what's worked well over the last few years for you and your team.
Yeah, so obviously we have quite a few different tools, and the way I tend to sort of see it is when it comes to just getting some numbers, and sort of self-serve tools like Tableau is quite straightforward, and enabling that is quite a big part of the job, making sure that again understanding what are the requirements for just a number versus an insight. That's quite powerful, because then you can make sure that you invest some time, and then self-serve tools like Tableau that we use a lot in Just Eat, then that even removes the need from you to actually serve some of those numbers. On the other spectrum, in terms of the insight itself, it's mostly, I tend to not necessarily use that much Tableau. Tableau is more of a self-serve tool and something that you can go and use in order to show some numbers. So the insight is more around customizing your approach to it. And often the challenge is that you have to present something in a room with different levels of seniority, different level of an appetite in terms of the data, but also in terms of understanding and comprehension of data. So typically the approach that we take is that we have different ways, different outputs for each of those audience. Typically it's in front of senior stakeholders. So a simple one slide with the insights, with the key bits that they want to take with them, and some sound bites usually works quite well. And at least have in the background some extra slides with more graphs in order to make some of the insights sort of come alive and emphasize some of the bits can also work quite well. In terms of the approach, even on how you deliver sort of those slides, it can vary. It can be a number of sort of sound bites, very punchy numbers that they can use, depending again on the insight. It can be a little bit more of a detailed approach. It could be done to much more innovative ways. Like, for example, yesterday I presented to some senior stakeholders some really complicated analysis around customer behaviors in the form of a Q&A. I put sort of 4 or 5 different questions and sort of some really punchy answers in order to communicate that difficult message. But typically, if I want to sort of show some numbers of how, or be able to show some things in a live environment, that's where most likely I will use either an Excel or a Tableau in order to have some numbers with me.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, going over to yourself, Christine, I imagine, again, that sort of presenting back the insights is probably one of the most important elements in in any business, but certainly a creative one where the numbers can just go straight over people's head.
Yeah. Actually, someone in the chat asked about Data Studio. In my current role, I don't use Data Studio, but I did a lot in my previous role because we were a Google company. Google and Data Studio work very, very well together, as you can imagine, in terms of like BigQuery and Data Studio. I do recommend Data Studio if you're just getting into data analysis. Data Studio is a wonderful place to start when you want to get into data visualization. You can upload your own CSV files and start, presenting things and putting things together in a way that's much more palatable than just having it live in an Excel sheet, for example. We're also a Tableau house, so we use Tableau in my current role, and that's where people can go again for like reporting and kind of self-serve. But in terms of delivering insights, I have a dual kind of role where I work in marketing and I work in data, so everything I put together has to be very pretty. So I work a lot with visualization. I mean, I still build in PowerPoint. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, my lunch timer is going off. I still build things just in PowerPoint in terms of like visualizing, but very pretty backgrounds, very pretty graphics. We have the added advantage that we have very pretty content to work with because we have wonderful artists that do very creative pieces. So I get to incorporate photos of Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion into regular presentations, which makes things quite fun. But in terms of actually expressing the numbers and expressing, again, just like everyone else has said before, it comes down to knowing the audience, and so it's very much tailored as to who I'm going to be speaking to. But I do always try to set the groundwork that everything I put together, if it's being packaged, is quite visually appealing to look at, because I also credit myself as a marketer, and I always say if something isn't visually appealing, people are less likely to engage with it. Even technical people are less likely to engage with it if it's not visually appealing. So that's something that's really important to me in order to help get my message across.
And would Tableau be your go-to sort of data visualization tool of choice, wherever you moved on, or do you think there's something better on the market, just in case anyone's here sort of watching, wondering what to invest in?
Yeah, I've used Domo, I've used Tableau, I've used Data Studio. I have yet to find the perfect solution. I prefer Data Studio because it's very, very quick. It's like a quick and dirty way to get something going as easily as possible. So it's usually my go-to if I'm just kind of like, it's like almost like my brainstorming area is usually just kind of dumped in Data Studio. But to be completely frank, I haven't found a platform that I'm absolutely in love with and blown away by. There's always something lacking, either ease of use, either visually how it looks, either the way it connects to things. So if anyone has ideas, I would love to hear some options.
Fine. And finally, Paul, it'd be great to hear your thoughts, and also, we'll come on to it more later, but how important when hiring for your teams in the past has it been that someone uses a certain tool, for instance? How much do you value that?
Okay, yeah. I just answer the question that firstly on the tool. My favorite tool, which is not one that I've used for a while, but it was my favorite, was a tool called Spotfire. I just love it. It just sort of connected with Paul Kelly, and I got loads done on it. And you could put Python in it, or I am Python anyway, and you were able to create charts and do lots of exception reporting, which was quite useful. Anyway, that's my sort of tooltip. Take it or leave it. It's pretty clunky and hard to use, but at the same time, I loved it. But I'm pretty clunky and hard to use, also, I've been told in the past. I think so. In terms of tools, in terms of tool sets, like I won't recruit because we've got tool A and you've got we've got Google Analytics and you've got Adobe Analytics, or vice versa. I mean, the two things are so similar that you're literally recruiting for 2 weeks. Is the way I see it. So you're sort of recruiting. If you recruit someone because they've got Adobe over GA, you're recruiting for 2 weeks, because that's about how long it will take someone to get used to the other system if they've never used it before. So these systems for me all sort of sit in their own ecosystem. So they're all, if you're a big corporate, it may be slightly different, but if you're smaller than that, then I think these things sit really nicely. You have a core of one of these providers, and then you just bolt stuff on and want to recruit for people that kind of understand that core system. But for me, I recruit, my recruitment process, which is kind of Intuit standard, is we do a set of initial interviews. Then if those interviews go well, we'll call you back, and you'll do a full day with us, or near enough a full day, part of which will be a craft interview. So we'll give you a ton of data, could be anything, and we'll expect you to go away and produce some insights and do some analytics on it, and pull out some insights that we then that's kind of how we judge you. And then if there's any gaps, or not gaps, but necessarily maybe areas in the job that we want to cover that didn't necessarily come out of the craft interviews, then the subsequent interviews, the rest of the day, we will pull those points out. It is a brilliant process. It really does help you understand how someone thinks, and helps you understand their proficiency, obviously, but probably better for me than a screening exam. Having someone come up and present their own work that they've done, that they've spent a long time figuring out the problem and the solution and the recommendations. And then the big question, because no one's perfect, and if I was given one of those crafts, and I was when I joined, but if there's always something, it could be a bit better, right? And the question you have is the person across the table, or on the Zoom as it is nowadays, that's put this presentation together, done all this work, can you work with them, and are there flaws, those areas, are you able to work with those and get them to a better place? And if they're high caliber, if they've put all the thought and the effort in, and there's a few bits that you're a bit worried about, I'll run with that. And if they haven't got this skill and they haven't got that skill, but their intellectual prowess and their ability to pull out insights and challenge and be curious is there, then that is the person that I want, as opposed to someone that's really familiar with Google Data Studio.
Sure. Thank you very much. It'd be, I guess, sort of following on from that, it'd be awesome to hear all three of your thoughts on interviewing, and especially at a more junior level, we're finding, so many of these sort of graduates or people with sort of, 1, 2, 3, 4 years experience all have exceptionally, strong technical skills, and they're all using a very similar tool set, be it SQL, Tableau, Power BI, an R or Python, etc. And therefore, differentiating between those candidates can be quite challenging. So just keen to understand, if you sort of take the technical skills away, in your eyes, what sort of sets an analyst apart, and what sort of tips and techniques do you have for people watching that sort of, I guess, just, for their softer skills like curiosity and data inquisitiveness and the ability to really sort of read between the lines and draw out insights? How are you looking for that at an interview? And yeah, maybe even if you want to start, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so there are a number of techniques, and I tend to like a lot, obviously, giving them some real examples, and just trying, to a large extent, that helps them get them actually into the shoes of the role and what they're likely to be doing. And the ways I usually tend to approach this by giving, in one of the stages of the interview, some quite open and sort of quite vague tasks for them, probably with a day or two to think of, and the real life examples, and very similar to what they would be doing if they would be successful. For example, recently I used, when I was recruiting, I used the example of what metrics and how would you use the data in order to understand the impact of COVID-19 to Just Eat. What metrics would you see? How would you approach it? And you normally have two questions. One which I leave very vague, and I'm expecting something quite specific, because it's still vague, the question, but I'm expecting to see some, to hear about some metrics. I'm not expecting necessarily to hear about calculations, but what metrics would you see? How would you go about doing it? And that, by giving them a little bit of time to think about it in advance, helps actually to see how they approach it. Secondly, the other example I give is more around giving them a little bit of a steer. So we've got this COVID-19 challenge, for example. Let's think of how would you approach it from a demand point, from a product angle, or from a supply angle. And you just give a little bit of information there just to provoke some thinking. And the idea during the interview is not necessarily to hear exactly the answer. The idea is actually really see how they've approached it to begin with. And secondly, depending on their level as well, see how they work with you in order to get to a desirable output, which to a large extent will resemble the way that we'll be working together in real life, as in have some time to think about this project, how about this question, and then start thinking how you would approach it from an analytical point of view, and then how do we work together to see how we will eventually approach it. And what's quite interesting is that you see individuals where they may have a really good head start in the interview because they've done a lot of the thinking, but actually their progression is not as good as someone who did they started with a fairly lower head start than others, but they've actually, with your help, they've progressed quite a lot, and they ended up to a higher level at the end. And it gives a really good version of how you can work with an individual as well.
So that sort of coachability element is something that you would look for.
Exactly. And in the vague questions often will start to give a really good view of the inquisitiveness of someone, and how innovative they can be in terms of their approach, in terms of what data they're thinking of using. And that gives a really good feel in terms of the potential of an individual, not necessarily what they'll do on day one with their technical skills, but more how quickly they'll actually add that extra added value to the business and to the role.
Perfect, thank you. And what about yourself, Christine? Anything that you particularly look for or value during that interview process on the softer skills?
Yeah, for me, obviously I work in the music industry, so it's always great to find someone that's really passionate about music, because that helps, especially if they're passionate about music and passionate about the industry, because we have a lot of weird nuances with our data that it's great to have someone that's already had experience with it. One thing I mean by nuances, for example, is people that understand how to take quantitative numbers and convert that to something that's qualitative and vice versa. So trying to figure out certain like some context around things that you can help to use for calculations. An example might be in my previous role at Universal. Universal owns all the rights to the Disney songs. So using some deductive reasoning to figure out when people that are 35 plus are listening to a whole lot of Disney, they might be parents. So those types of things, having that type of thought process is really important to bring someone on board, because we don't have a one-to-one interaction with our customers. So you have to get creative with how you're working with the data that you are given. So I'm always looking for creativity. Another space that I'm really looking for is being able to problem solve. One interview question I always ask really frequently is, how would you approach classifying genre, for example? And I'm always eager to hear how people answer that question. Some people might go by saying, oh, I'm going to pull some information from an API. Some people might say, I'm going to do a cluster analysis or things like that. And there's no real right answer in that scenario. But I'm just really curious to kind of hear how people think and what their thought process is like. Because they usually, when I ask that question, they usually think it out with me simultaneously. So it's really interesting to kind of understand how they're thinking. And if they come up with more than one answer is what I'm really looking for, more so than like having the right answer. In addition to that, I think someone actually in the chat asked about this, and I want to reference it, about having like doing like the data analytics courses and things like that online. I did a boot camp to learn Python. I took a 12-week course to learn SQL. I don't think there's any right or wrong way to learn these things as long as you learn them. Most importantly, it's how you actually market those skills and how you present that they are relevant. Like you were saying, Rupert, the baseline of having those technical skills are there, but it's, can you use them to execute on what you need to do, is much more important than just having them. So just the course alone, I don't think is going to be as effective as, hey, I can use this to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. Especially, I just want to add that when it comes to working in data analytics, there's a lot of different roles that exist within that space. Everything from data engineering to insights to BI, et cetera. And so just having the foundation of those tech skills alone, you still need all those other layers of things. Like I work in marketing, for example, so I have to have a full understanding of digital marketing space in addition to the data analysis, in addition to the music industry experience. So all of those things are really important, not just like, I know Python and SQL, so that's really helpful, obviously.
Awesome, thank you. I'm sure there are also some other over 35s who do just enjoy watching Disney without kids as well. But I won't name any names here. And Paul, I know you spoke about the rationale for some of the selection during the interview process, but is there any particular methods that you would use if you were hiring now to test for these skills?
Well, the first one is I'd ask them, at what age did they start listening to Disney? No, so in all seriousness, I think questions that I ask to really get under the skill set, I think we mainly rely on the craft for that. So you can either, you're given a dump of data and you can either make sense of it or you can't. And to the level to which degree that you do make sense of it. What we're looking for is someone that can, someone that's able to, what we're not after is someone to, work comprehensively for 7 days, building out every single, different type of, Maxi algorithm to predict whatever. That's not what we're after. We're after, what I would say, 80% core, really good single case analysis. So we're not looking for big data solutions. All right, even with, you can allude to it in the interview. It's just too much ground to cover. For me, anyway. You've got, even in a day, you've got. There's so many rabbit holes you can go down. So really zero in on what I would say is in the interview, really zero in on the skill sets that you want to show. And that may be, if your super strength is, Python and, random forests on that, or on, if that's your skill set and you know it really, really well inside out, do that. And then work from there. If that isn't, do not on your first, if you're going for an interview, do not think, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to learn, whatever, and I'm going to give it a go in the interview. And I have genuinely seen someone thought, well, I thought they'd use this as an opportunity to learn. And it was just a sort of bag of dirty washing that I was handed as I was trying to figure out what they'd done. So that would be, stick with your super strength, demonstrate the fact that you're willing to learn. Nobody knows every single code out there. No one does. So, admit your weaknesses and just, demonstrate that you're willing to learn.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. So thank you for that. And I guess sort of final topic before we head on to the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, this would be a great time to start typing them out. One of the difficulties that I often sort of see people or hear people complain about is how difficult it is to convince the stakeholders or C-level that they need investment. And that could be by way of additional headcount. It could be by way of a new analytical tool. So I'd be keen to learn, how you demonstrate their return on investment. Because if you look at a salesperson, you can go, right, they can bring in X amount of revenue, we'll pay them 50 grand a year, and they'll bring in 250 grand. And straight away you can see. So in the analytics space, but I obviously believe data analysts should be seen as a salesperson, if you like, someone who's going to add value to the business rather than a cost center. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that topic and how you convince stakeholders that you need the investment. And Christina, if you want to start, that'd be great.
Yeah, so that's actually really tough in my space. Being in the music industry, obviously, data scientist was probably one of the last people to come over aboard to the label side. So that's always been a really tough sell for us. So as we have progressed as an industry and looked around to our the people we work with closely, like the Spotify's and the Apples of the world, I think we're starting to figure out that data is much more valuable to the company, which has been very helpful from that external standpoint. Internally, I have to do a lot of qualitative research in my day-to-day. So for example, right now we're working through the process of acquiring a data tool that I think would be important to us. So that involved me talking with all 45 territories labels and asking them how long they're spending on a certain type of report. They fed back to me how many hours they're spending every week on a report. And I did a calculation that we were spending 2,000 hours across the company on some report. And like, this will address all 2,000 of those hours. And this is why I think we should invest in this product, for example. A different thing I might say is, hey, we need someone that can, we need another headcount because we have this whole new project that's going to be vital for the company, but we need someone to run it. And so phrasing things and structuring things in a way where you're showing what the ROI is going to be is really important, even if you cannot say the ROI of like your actual analysis and insights. I think it's really tough to say, hey, my analysis is going to make you this much money. I wish I could do that. Unfortunately, I cannot usually say that. And so figuring out things like like manpower and things like that is much more useful, that at least I can show you some tactical numbers. And I'm like, I promise you, this is real numbers that people are buying to me that we can address basically.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And even over to you.
So the easiest way in order to make the case is by identifying together with the stakeholders gaps that we have, either in tools or capabilities or data sources. So often at the back of an analysis or at the back of an insight that we did, we can identify that if only we knew this, and what could we else sort of have in order to make this even more powerful or increase our confidence in terms of the output that we shared and the insight that we shared. So it's a joint approach to a large extent. And then obviously looking when we're talking about tooling, looking at things like let's do a trial. Let's see, whether we can see even incremental gains, and at the back of that, make sure that the business case, when we form it, is quite high confidence in terms of the output and the return. And often a lot, obviously, similarly to the rest of the panel, we have the same challenges and the same approach. The other thing that I often sort of consider is also looking the level of spend and investment, and sort of making the case probably at the back of that to say that we're keen to make sure that we optimize all the investment that will go into a certain project or to a certain sort of territory, and in order to make sure that we give it proper attention without any without omitting any other big priorities and capabilities that we want to maintain. What else what do we need in order to fill that gap and serve that specific need?
Awesome, thanks. And I know Paul, previously for those watching, Paul was at Barclaycard, and I know that when you're trying to get things signed off, you have to go through a lot of pairs of hands. So are there any sort of tips that you would give to people watching on how to go about it?
I think there's plenty of people that would recognise the red tape can slow down innovation. I think what I would say is just put yourself in the mind of the CEO or whoever it is that's got the purse string, because management is a judgment, and the judgment is formed on a calculation. So you will be competing with others, right? If there's headcount knocking around, you'll be competing with the sales team, the marketing team, whoever. And the calculation on a salesperson is really easy, right? Your average person per day, how many sales phone calls do they make on inside sales, or how many people do they visit, and how many do they convert on average? Well, go and get another salesperson, and that gives you that number of accounts per day, per week, per month, right? And you can cost that. It's really simple to understand. So you've got to present something that's equally simple to understand in terms of the value. And with data, you zero in on either, or you can. So I'd say three actually. So I've done it three ways. So I'd zero in on acquisition and say, if you do this, right, you've got a number of salespeople or whatever it is, and this piece of technology, this statistical method, whatever it is you're proposing, will make your salespeople, 20% more efficient, and that will create the same number of or more than just getting another salesperson in. You get my drift. So they'll get you 20 a day, I can get you 35. That type of response. So that's the kind of acquisition. Then there's cost saving. So you also, a lot of data analytics is about efficiency. It's about finding optimization. It's about driving down cost, whether it's in marketing with CPCs and CPAs, or whatever it is, getting the lid on the cost button. So that's easy to price up and say, look, it's going to cost you X amount for this tool or this person, but they're going to save all this money. Thirdly, there's the sort of balance sheet method, which is, a bit of acquisition, bit of cost saving, whack it together, and you've got double bubble. And that looks really, if you can do that, if you found a project that not only does it acquire, but it also makes you more efficient, thinking SEO as opposed to PPC, for example, then by investing in that, you're going to get your balance sheet is much, much better off. So there's a sort of three positions I'd take.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much for all your thoughts over those various topics. Pleased to say there are a few questions that have come in. I will try and we'll try and run through as many as possible. One from Beatrice is, can one of you give an example of the different metrics you would display depending on the seniority of the person you're presenting it to? For example, the difference between reporting to, say, a marketing director and to the CEO. I don't know if anyone in particular has a recent example they could give or wants to jump in.
Yeah, I expand on something I mentioned earlier. So essentially I was talking about I didn't use any numbers for a presentation. And so in that situation, what I was doing is I was doing an analysis of a marketing campaign for actually Ed Sheeran's one of our biggest artists. I was doing an analysis of a marketing campaign for that. So instead of showing a bunch of numbers in terms of like the click-through rate and cost per click and things like that, instead I showed, I clustered all the different audiences together that we were running targeting against for that campaign, and I built out personas around those audiences. So instead of showing, like, we got this much click-through rate on this target, we had a mood board that showed, like, this is the pop culture fans, and it had a picture of E! Online, and it had a picture of, I don't know, like, like a reality TV show and things like that kind of showed the types of things these people would be into in terms of how to talk about the audience. And this is based around things like the search terms they were using, stuff that we were using for remarketing audiences and things like that. And then on the subsequent pages, I then showed, instead of saying click-through rate was 4% or 5%, I said, click-through rate high, view-through rate, because we had YouTube ads low, et cetera, et cetera. And then I had a bit of an explanation as to what this signified about this audience. So for example, there was some audiences that are really receptive towards e-commerce while others were not. if I was presenting that was going to a label president, so that's why I didn't have too many numbers. If I was presenting that to the CEO does not care about my click-through rates, so I probably wouldn't include those at all. I would just scrap that entirely. It'd be a much shorter presentation, probably maybe 3-4 pages, show some of the information about the personas, for example, and just talk about what this audience is good for, what this audience is bad for, and then, you know, expect the follow-up questions in the conversation we're having versus like looking at the presentation, basically.
Right, so a shorter presentation with perhaps a longer Q&A depending on the audience.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry, go on.
Can I just quickly answer that? Because that's a really interesting question as well. And I think we have in Intuit True North goals, which align throughout the whole company. But obviously, depending on the granularity of where you are in that and what team you're in, which True North goals really matter to you. But they're sort of employee True North goals, customer, shareholder, and communities. And absolutely, any presentation I give, whether it's the marketing director or the CEO, I make sure that first, before I'm doing it, it's aligned to those True North goals, and I know exactly which ones I'm answering, because if they're not aligned to the True North goals, you know, why am I doing this piece of work? First off. Secondly, when it's to the CEO, you've got to show, I think, you've got to step up a level and show what we sort of call T-shaped leadership. So you're really strong in your column, but you can reach across to different products and you can start to link and sync. And so not just be an analyst, but also talk about, you know, the product, talk about marketing, how you can bring in marketing, sales, customer success, how this whole thing is going to work together as a single entity rather than just what you're doing. And the CEOs really do respond to that. The other thing I'd say, any presentation you're going to give, go through each slide, particularly if it's a CEO, if it's someone senior, and just every time you look at a piece of analysis, a piece of insight, a chart, in particular charts, and just say, so what? So what? What does this mean? Okay, what am I trying to say? Why have I put this chart in here? So what? And then when you do that mental jump, you'll realize that the chart enough isn't alone, and the commentary needs to explain what you actually mean, because otherwise the chart may not mean the same thing to the CEO as it does to you, which can then cause confusion and on occasion embarrassment.
Perfect, thank you very much. That's really handy. And there's a question about the data analytics courses, and Natasha mentions Data Camp and Coursera. Do you, as a sort of employer, do you put value on those? And if not, you know, are there any sort of particular tools out there in the market that you would recommend learning? Personally, I think SQL is something that I see on virtually every job spec, and that all my clients ask for to answer that. But I'm sure she wants your thoughts, not mine.
Yeah. So quickly, it depends on the individual really, and I think it's you can take on a new course in terms of either to broaden your acumen and your skills and learn something new, or to make yourself in effect even more expert into a specific sort of area, into a specific skill. I think what's more important than the actual list or the actual course is the willingness of the individual to develop themselves, and how did they really approach, why did they actually do a particular course. Was it in order to cement some of their knowledge? Was it to get up to speed with a new skill or with new developments in a particular area? Or was it just because they wanted to explore a new sort of domain? And there is, as Paul mentioned earlier as well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a specific course or a specific sort of platform. And definitely I wouldn't recommend to do something for the sake of an interview, or do a specific course for the sake of a particular reason. Proactivity, yes, but it needs to serve a purpose. And it's not really necessarily how long the list of courses that you did. It's more around sort of the purpose that they serve, and how have you approached that.
Perfect, thanks very much. There's a question here from Harry. He says he finds transforming quant data into qual data a lot easier and sort of efficient compared to the other way around. And he wondered if any of you had any tips on how to approach a situation where, you know, you might have to transform qual and quant? I don't know if anyone's had that issue to be able to answer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most practical ways, obviously, is looking at things like dummy variables. So, for instance, with me, I'm working with genre, for example, and in that situation, if I'm looking, like, if I need to say, oh, is this pop, is this not? That's just like a literal text situation where I'm like, pop one, you know, this one, you know, rock two, rock one, et cetera, et cetera. So from that standpoint, that's pretty simple. When it comes to like just trying to take actual qualitative data and like converting it, I would think about what you're trying to accomplish with that data. It might be, for instance, if you're looking at survey data. One thing I just did with some survey data, for example, is I looked through the data. You can either do it, I've done it in a way where I was doing like natural language processing, or I've done it manually, where I'm going through and like clustering together like common themes, for example. So I have the general idea of what each person's comment is, and kind of can theme those together, so I have a better picture of this is what everyone overall is saying about this topic. For example, I've done something similar with like YouTube comments, looking at the general consensus of YouTube comments based around certain keywords people are saying. So there are some ways about to get around it, but I definitely know it's not quite as easy as the other way around.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I think from what I can see, the last unanswered question is around, you know, in a high growth or sort of startup environment, you know, is there a point in which you would expect to see investment into hiring a data analyst as a sort of specialized role? Is there sort of a tipping point? Is there a revenue goal or moment where you feel it would be needed? I appreciate you're not all working in startups, but if anyone has any...
Yeah, I'll tell you. I was just literally typing an answer, but I might as well just say it.
Right.
I need to go back to school for typing. So I'd say that startups normally, you know, start with a lot of hypotheses, not much data-backed work, and they start to generate some good growth. And then they get to a point where that growth is going really well, and then it starts to tail off, and they don't know why. I would say that's the point to get an analyst, because otherwise, you know, more hypotheses at that point are not going to work, or are less likely to work. So if you're just guessing at that point, and you're looking at red dashboards and you don't know why, or you know your sales are just not coming through, you might not even have dashboards, then I think definitely it's time to get an analyst. The other thing I would say is, from the beginning, before that, and for your own sanity as if you're running the startup or whatever, get a data engineer from the beginning. You might not need an analyst, but you will definitely need someone to put a data management framework together, to make sure your data is organized, to make sure that it's robust, and that it is able in future to scale, so that you can do some of the analytics that you're going to want to do in the future.
I would say, to add to that, I definitely agree, especially about the data engineer for Paul. I would say get an analyst as early as you can, to be honest, because ideally you would have had someone telling you that the sales drop-off was going to happen before it happened. In an ideal world, they'd be able to identify the trends, understand the industry, and get to identify, you know, the competitors that are coming after you and things like that as early as possible from a data standpoint. So if you can afford one, even if it's like to start off with, you know, an intern or something like that, someone around that's just looking at the numbers for you, I think it's really, really helpful.
Actually, I agree. That's better advice, because if you're looking at red arrows on a dashboard or whatever, it's already too late. You're past the point. But if you are looking at red arrows, definitely get one.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think that's a wrap. I don't think there's any more unanswered questions. So
I see a note from Felicia that I think is probably directed towards me, so I want to address it really quickly. I didn't have a chance to type back to her. Basically, she's talking about how to be able to present her tech skills, because it's really hard usually to display, like, you could say I'm good at SQL, but I imagine it's really hard to like show people your SQL project. And so regarding that, it's always the easiest way, obviously, is to do some type of online course so you have that type of certificate. I don't think you need to even pay for one, but even having that, I think, is just better than absolutely nothing. But usually if a company is very focused on SQL, they'll probably just give you a quiz on it or some type of test on it. So I wouldn't be too concerned about having to display that. Regarding Python, you can always just upload a project that you've worked on into something like GitHub, for example, or put together even a project. And that's an easy way for people to kind of know that you're proficient in Python.
Awesome. Well, look, yeah, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in, and yeah, massive thank you to all three of you again for taking times out of your busy diaries to give your thoughts. Really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone watching does as well.
I've just seen Felicia's other note as well, which, sorry, very quickly, which is a really interesting point around being in a marketing team and being forced to use Excel. What I would just say there, even if you're really junior, Felicia, show leadership. So you can lead them to a better place. You can show them what life could be like post Excel, how you can scale data way beyond what they're currently doing at the moment. So carry on with your, carry on with your doing the training that you can. Get Anaconda up and running in the organization. Feed in CSV files. Do it hand to mouth until it gets up and running. But when they see the difference, that's when it will be embedded.
Awesome. Cool. Well, look, thank you. Yeah, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone does. And yeah, I'll let you all have some lunch now. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Thanks so much, guys.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.